flow back to the heart. And we're going to start with the head. So, how many of you covered dural sinuses in File 430? Remember the term dural sinus? You know the name. You know dural matter? Yeah. Okay. So the dural matter stands for tough mother, and it's the connective tissue that forms a sac around the brain. And this is a piece of plasticized real dural matter. All right. And where it comes down between the two cerebral hemispheres in the longitudinal fissure, we call it the falx cerebri. Yep. And between the occipital lobe and the cerebellum, it's called the tentorium cerebelli. All right. There are no blood vessels in the dura mater, but remember the subarachnoid space or the subdural space has cerebrospinal fluid in it, and then arachnoid villi penetrate into these sinuses for the drainage of cerebrospinal fluid. So, if I draw a superior view of this dural sinus, and here would be the falx cerebri, it splits at the top to create this space. Right? And the arachnoid matter is a thin layer that adheres to the inner surface of that. And then it has these spidery legs, that's why it's called arachnoid matter. And the spidery legs are attached to the pia mater. And this is where CSF fluid is. So in the sinuses, which are not blood vessels, but are just gaps, kind of a split, a schism of the dura mater, the arachnoid matter bulges in, and let me draw that a little bit larger. The arachnoid matter bulges in, and creates a little cauliflower-like structure. Known as arachnoid villus. I don't know if you remember those terms or not, but if you don't, you can look them up. And so across this space, the diffuse CSF.
Did you just, that's the same thing?
This is the same as that. I just enlarged it. Okay? So also, we would have veins from the surface of the brain and from the periosteum coming in and delivering venous blood from those structures. So the sinuses are carrying a mixture of CSF from the ventricles and blood from the brain, deoxygenated blood from the brain. So this one right here in the midline is known as the superior sagittal sinus. And on the plasticized dura mater, you can see it right here, running down the midline. Okay. So I created this morning, as I was lecturing, a little example of this because a lot of the students this morning hadn't covered it. So this would be the falx cerebri. And the superior sagittal sinus is in the midline of that. Over the middle here, which is going over the corpus callosum, would be the inferior sagittal sinus. And fluid there would drain back towards the superior sagittal sinus in a space known as the straight sinus. Okay? Then I'll diagram this on the board as well. This is the tentorium cerebelli, separating the occipital lobe above from the cerebellum beneath. All right, and then from the straight sinus, the fluid can go left or right via the transverse sinuses. Everybody got that pathway? From the transverse sinus, so this would be up near the temporal ridge, temporal bone, so posterior fossa, cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa. So from here, the sinuses form a kind of double curve, a sigmoid curve, towards the jugular foramen. And at the jugular foramen, we have the beginning of the internal jugular vein. All right, so I'm going to diagram that on the board, as well as show it to you here on the screen. So here is the false cerebri. Here would be the superior sagittal sinus running along the top, as I drew on that piece of paper. Inferior sagittal sinus. From the inferior sagittal sinus, it could drain back through the straight sinus and join the fluid in the superior sagittal sinus. Then it can go to the left or to the right in the transverse sinus, and that's kind of behind the screen here, but shown here. And then down the sigmoid sinuses, and here at the jugular vein, jugular foramen, the internal jugular vein begins. And that carries the venous blood and the CSF fluid out of the brain. So in this diagram, again, superior sagittal sinus, inferior sagittal sinus, straight sinus. This is showing the right side, so we have the transverse sinus, sigmoid sinus, down to the jugular foramen. So if you look inside the skull, you can actually see grooves in the skull where these vessels were, it created a embedment while the bone tissue was still soft and hadn't hardened yet. So superior sagittal sinus. Inferior sagittal sinus. And then the inferior sagittal sinus connects to the superior via the straight sinus. So on the head model, you can see the superior sagittal sinus and the straight sinus. Here's superior in the dura mater, and between the occipital lobe and the cerebellum, here's the straight sinus. Okay. You can't see the transverse sinus because it's going back around this way in the bone. Okay. So I'll bring that around out towards you. And it's going this direction, so I'm showing it in a dotted line. It's going behind the bone, behind the board. Okay. So this is curving along the occipital bone right here. And then it will go toward medially and form the sigmoid sinus. So straight sinus.
So it's like there's two straight sinuses?
I'm sorry, my mistake. Transverse sinus. Sigmoid sinus. And then right here we would have our jugular foramen. And then now, continuing down the side of the neck, we would have the internal jugular vein. Not a carotid vein. We don't have any carotid veins, okay? We have internal and external jugular veins. So that's what you're seeing right here, this beginning of the internal jugular vein. Yes?
Isn't it just one sigmoid sinus?
There's two. The other one's over here. If I drew it in, I don't know, I thought it might make it a little messy. That'd be on the back side, and the jugular vein on the opposite side, the jugular foramen. Okay.
So there would be like two jugular veins?
There's two internal jugular veins down each side of it. Yes.
The one with the one that goes behind, what's called?
Well, we would have another transverse and we'd have another sigmoid. Because
Oh,
they're splitting and going both directions.
okay.
So we have one superior sagittal, one inferior sagittal, one straight. And then
So those-
2 transverse, 2 sigmoid. Yeah,
All right,
And
thank you.
so 2 jugular foramens also?
one on each side of the skull. So if we were to trace a drop of blood from the superior sagittal sinus to the internal jugular vein, we would go superior sagittal sinus. Is it going to go through the straight sinus? If it gets here, it's not going to go back up. It's going to go left or right. So it would go into the transverse sinus. And from there, it would go to the sigmoid sinus. To the internal jugular vein. If we were to start with the inferior sagittal sinus, all right, we would have inferior sagittal sinus. Going into the straight sinus. And then that would go via the transverse sinuses. Okay? All right. So now I want to add the external jugular vein to it. So I'm going to erase what I have on there and just draw the internal and add to it the external. So we're going to be looking at this aspect of the diagram that's on the board, on the screen, without looking at inside the skull. Okay? So I'm going to redraw this starting just at this point and a little bit higher up on the board. Can I erase it? Am I okay with that? Okay. So here would be the jugular foramen, and we'll bring the internal jugular vein down. Let me bring that down a little bit farther because I want to draw my face. Not my face, but my face. So internal jugular vein. And the internal jugular vein is going to join with the subclavian vein to form the brachiocephalic vein. And we have 2 sets of brachiocephalic veins. We only had one brachiocephalic artery, but we have 2 brachiocephalic veins. The brachiocephalic vein on the left side has farther to travel. So these are not of equal size. So the brachiocephalic vein on the left side is going to be longer. Anybody know why? The 2 brachiocephalic veins are joining to form what vessel? Superior vena cava. And the superior vena cava is draining into the right atrium, and that's way over here on the right side of the sternum. Okay? So the left brachiocephalic vein has to come from here. The right brachiocephalic vein only has to come from here. It's already closer. So our right brachiocephalic vein is shorter than our left brachiocephalic vein. But both of these are brachiocephalic veins. So we have 2. So it's equal bilateral. Whatever we have on the right side, we have on the left side, as far as what's draining towards the superior vena cava. Okay? Then we have draining the face, the side of the head. We have the same veins that we had with our arteries. All right, so we have a facial vein. The facial vein, however, tends to most often drain directly into the internal jugular, rather than going only into the external jugular. The external jugular will drain, the superficial temporal veins will drain into the external jugular. And I'll write these up here in just a moment. The maxillary vein will drain into the external jugular. And some of the other ones that you didn't have to know, the occipital vein and so on, all right? There can be a connection from our facial vein to the external jugular. And that's called the retromandibular vein. All right, so let me write these names up here before we get too mixed up. So facial vein normally drains into the internal jugular. But via the retromandibular vein, which means behind the mandible, it can connect to the external jugular. Superficial temporal vein and maxillary vein. All right, so if we look at our head, here's the superficial temporal artery. Right beside it is superficial temporal vein. Coming down, coming from the occipital vein in the back, it runs into the external jugular. The external jugular is very small compared to the internal jugular, and it is found superficial to the sternocleidomastoid muscle. You can barely see the internal jugular vein here. It's protected and covered by the sternocleidomastoid muscle, and it's going to travel with the internal carotid and common carotid artery. Those are under high pressure and need to be protected. All right? So if you see a vein superficial to the sternocleidomastoid, that's going to be the external jugular vein. Retromandibular isn't seen here, but it would be traveling right along the margin of the mandible here to get from facial to external jugular. So on the chart, or on the screen here, here's facial going into internal jugular. Here's maxillary and superficial temporal forming external jugular. This is the occipital, which you don't have to know. Okay? So in a similar location to what we call the carotids, but we don't have any carotid veins. We do have a vertebral vein traveling with the vertebral artery. So I'll just place that in position here. And I usually draw it on this side just so I don't make it, it comes in the back. So we often see it between external and internal jugular. But just for clarification so it doesn't confuse our drawing, I'll put it here. Okay. And the thyrocervical vein exists as well, but I'm not going to bother putting it up there. Yes?
Wouldn't it be going down the vertebral?
Well, it's coming down from the foramen magnum and draining into the subclavian.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So this is our subclavian. And over here, after all of these other branches would be draining on the left side as well. I'm just not drawing them in there. Okay, so it'd be bilateral. Whatever we find over here, we find over here as well. Okay? So subclavian vein, vertebral vein, external jugular vein, and internal jugular vein. So the vertebral and external jugulars are draining into the subclavian. The internal jugular is draining into the brachiocephalic, right? And then the two brachiocephalics join together to form the superior vena cava. All right. Now let's do the veins which drain yesterday.
What about the internal thoracic?
I'll do that in a minute, because I want to do the upper extremity, and then we'll look at the ones that drain the chest cavity. Okay?
How do we know which one is the subclavian and which one is the brachiocephalic?
As soon as you see the internal jugular, the subclavian stops.
Okay.
Okay? So if we look at this quiz question, we were looking at the arteries. Right brachiocephalic, left brachiocephalic, internal jugular, subclavian. Okay. This still has a sternocleidomastoid, so here is the external jugular draining into the subclavian, and here's the internal jugular covered up by the sternocleidomastoid. Okay. So again, you can look at those on the model in the back, because we have that model. Okay. So the two brachiocephalics come to form the superior vena cava. Brachiocephalics are formed by subclavian and internal jugular. Okay. All right, so we had the arteries that supply the upper extremity. And remember when we talked about the arteries, we had subclavian, became axillary, became brachial, became radial and ulnar. So we have those same veins, all right? So we start down here. Again, my forearm drawing is going to be a bit wide to get all of these vessels in. So on the lateral aspect, we have the radial. On the medial aspect, we have the ulnar. Those two form the brachial vein. And we have the radial and ulnar branches. Radial vein, you don't have to worry about the arch. The palmar arches will have a different set of arches. Ulnar vein. Brachial vein. And then I'm going to define the axillary vein slightly differently with superficial veins. So these are the deep veins that are traveling with the arteries of the same name, same location. Now we also have superficial veins that are just under the skin. And I'm going to bring a camera on Tuesday because I have a student that sits right here in the morning that had wonderful, she hates them because they're so prominent, but she had wonderful veins, superficial veins. And you could see them really clearly. So I told the morning class, I'm going to take a picture of her veins and use them on the exam. Because her superficial veins were just beautiful, at least anatomically so. So I'm going to draw the superficial veins in purple. And starting on the back, all right, you can see on my hand we have a dorsal venous arch on the back. And then it comes lateral and travels up and empties into the axillary just before the axillary becomes subclavian. So I'll draw that laterally here. Again, like I said, it's going to make my forearm really wide, but all right, this lateral superficial vein is known as the cephalic vein. And the subclavian vein begins as soon as the cephalic vein empties into the axillary vein. So this is going to be the axillary vein here. And again, if you look at the brown torso back here, you can see the axillary vein up here in the axilla. But here on the shoulder, between the deltoid and pectoralis major muscles, we have the superficial vein. That is the cephalic vein. And here's the clavicle. It's diving down through the muscle to reach the axillary vein, and then the rest, it will then be called the subclavian vein. Right? So it pierces deep, it's superficial here, and it pierces deep to get access to the axillary vein. So where it enters into, it's still axillary. So if you were to trace a drop of blood flow from the back of the hand, all right, you'd have the dorsal venous arch, and then you'd go up the cephalic vein, that we're doing this superficially, and then you would go into the axillary vein, and then you would have subclavian vein, okay? So cephalic drains into axillary. Now, on the medial side, we have basilic. Not basilar, all right, but basilic. And basilic drains partway up. It's going to join with the brachial vein to form the axillary. So as soon as those two come together, we have the axillary vein. So basilic vein. So between, this is joining in with the brachial. So if we're draining drop of blood through the basilic, we go basilic to axillary. So brachial and basilic together are now axillary. Okay, so axillary is from here to there. If I draw a dotted line, that would be axillary. Or actually, this is draining into axillary, so this might be there. Now, this is the most complicated of our superficial vessels, all right? In the lower extremity, we just have two. We don't connect them. We just have the small saphenous and the great saphenous, and we're done with it. But have you ever had blood drawn for some sort of blood chemistry or something? You do it right here near your elbow, the cubital fossa. All right, so we have two patterns, what I call an H pattern and a V pattern, that connect the basilic and the cephalic veins. And what was so cool about Christine is she had the H pattern on one arm and the V pattern on the other. Well, I had both of them. I used to just talk about one, but some models, for instance, our wire model here shows the V pattern, okay? With two branches coming down, and others will have other models, like the green flat model has the H pattern. So that's why I started talking about both. The students were like, well, I don't see the H or I don't see the Y, so I had to do both. I'm going to draw the H pattern here, and then over here on this side I'll draw the Y, okay? So this particular diagram is showing the H. So cephalic starts on the back of the hand in the dorsal venous arch, crosses over the wrist onto the anterior forearm. Here it's coming up and then going up the lateral arm. Here is the basilic vein starting medial by the little finger, coming up here And then the median cubital. Cubital fossa is your elbow fossa, okay? So here is the median cubital. That's your H. Okay? And then we have a vessel that drains the forearm, which is called the median antebrachial. And in the H, it drains into the basilic vein, or towards the edge of the H. So let me draw that here.
That's the superficial?
Yeah, this is superficial, okay? So that would be the median cubital. And then we would have the median antebrachial either draining into the median cubital, but on that diagram it's draining into the basilic. Veins are very variable. Ante means fore, brachial arm. So forearm, median antebrachial drains the forearm. Okay? Now, if we look at the Y pattern, I'm not going to draw any of these other branches here. I'll just draw these deep branches coming in so you can. So cephalic is going to be here. Basilic here. Okay. And then the Y pattern is, or V pattern, like this. Okay. So you can see that it doesn't take too much for if the median cubital is coming out of that one and that one angles slightly, you start to get that V appearance instead of the H appearance. So again, cephalic. So this is median cephalic. This is basilic. So this is median basilic, and this is still median antebrachial. So when you have the Y or the V, you don't have a median cubicle. The median basilic and cephalic, median cephalic take its place. That one you might want to take a picture of. It's a little complicated. Like I said, Christine had one in one arm and one in the other. I'm going to bring my camera next week and take a picture of it. And then I can show it to you in the afternoon class if I figure out how to transfer it over. I've already asked her permission. Okay, so if I were to say trace a drop of blood from the little finger to the heart, you would have all sorts of different combinations. So I'd have to give some clues to which of those vessels I already put into the sequence. All right, so if we're starting with the deep portion, we just go straight little finger into the ulnar vein, into the brachial vein, into the axillary vein, subclavian vein, brachiocephalic vein, heart. Or I could take a superficial route. And I could go from the little finger to the basilic vein, into the axillary, into the subclavian. Or I could cross over to the other side and go basilic to median cephalic to median basilic to median cephalic to cephalic. All right, but the only reason I put up the H and the Y is not to make your life complicated, but because we have both illustrated on our models. Okay? And it was an answer to students' questions. Well, this looks different than I had to go do some research, and we do have these two variations. Okay. All right. So now let's look at the drainage of the anterior chest wall. Half of it is similar, and half of it is slightly different. All right, so we're going to add a couple of new vessels from the posterior aspect. So on this view, it's kind of hard to see, which is why I got the other diagram. Here's the superior vena cava. Here's the inferior vena cava. All right, internal thoracic is going to have its same anterior intercostal veins and such. So here's the internal thoracic, and here are anterior intercostal veins draining into internal thoracic. Okay. And that's the anterior, so it's very similar to what we had with our arterial system. It's the posterior intercostals that are different. Why do you think the posterior intercostals are different? What vessel are we missing? The aorta. We have no complement to the aorta in the thoracic cavity, because the inferior vena cava comes in and stops about an inch above the diaphragm, and the superior vena cava comes down and stops at the right atrium. So we've got a gap, and we have no vessel there for the intercostals to drain into. Okay, so we have to have a separate vessel. Can I erase this now? Okay, just a sec. Sure.
Take a picture of it.
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.